Nobody was supposed to be in the studio that night. The session had ended at 11. The engineers had gone home, the musicians had gone home, Sam Cooke had said goodnight and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. And then, when the doors closed, he pressed a different button. He went back upstairs. He sat down at the piano. He played for 3 hours. And a young man who had been about to give up on everything he had ever wanted heard every note. His name was Daniel. He was 22 years old and had been working at the studio for 8 months, the lowest position available, the kind of job that involved carrying things and making coffee and staying late and saying yes to everything in the hope that eventually something would happen that justified the staying and the yes. He wanted to write music. He had wanted to write music since he was 12 years old, had grown up in a small town in Ohio where the radio was the closest thing to a music education available, and had absorbed everything it offered with the specific intensity of someone who understands, before they can explain why, that this is the thing. He had come to New York because New York was where music was. He had been in New York for 8 months and had written almost nothing. Daniel had stayed late to finish an inventory that nobody had asked him to finish that night, but that he had decided to finish anyway, because finishing things felt like the only form of control available to him at that particular point in his life. He had been there since 9 in the morning. He had watched the musicians arrive for the afternoon session, watched the session happen, watched the engineers make adjustments and the producer make notes, and Sam Cooke stand at the microphone and do the thing that Sam Cooke did that made everyone in the room pay slightly closer attention than they had been paying a moment before. He had watched everyone leave. He had gone to the back office and started on the inventory. He was in the back office with a clipboard and a list when he heard the elevator. He assumed it was the overnight cleaning crew. He went back to his inventory, and then the piano started.
Sam Cooke had been coming back to the studio after everyone left for years. It was not a secret exactly. The overnight staff knew, and a few engineers had noticed the piano sometimes sounded different in the morning than it had when they left. Nobody asked about it. It was understood, in the way that certain things are understood in workplaces where people pay attention, to be Sam's time, the hours between the end of the session and the beginning of whatever came next. The time that belonged to no one and required nothing and had no audience and no purpose except the one Sam gave it when he sat down at the piano and started to play. What he played in those hours was never the same twice. Sometimes it was versions of songs he was working on, trying different approaches, finding angles that the daytime sessions with their schedules and their objectives didn't allow him to find. Sometimes it was older material, gospel songs he had learned as a child, the church music that had formed his voice and his understanding of what music was for before he understood that music could be a career. Sometimes it was nothing he could name, just the piano doing what pianos do when the person playing them has stopped performing and started listening to what comes out. That was what made those hours different from the sessions. During sessions, Sam was working, precise, professional, the most controlled singer anyone in the studio had ever worked with, a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why at every moment of the recording process. In those late hours, the control was set aside, deliberately, the way you set something down when you need your hands free. He was not making anything. He was not trying to make anything. He was just playing. And the difference between those two things was, if you happened to hear it, unmistakable.
Daniel stood up from his desk when the piano started. He moved to the door of the back office and opened it and stood in the corridor, listening. The studio was at the end of the corridor, a heavy door, soundproofed but not completely sealed, and at this hour, with nothing else making noise in the building, the piano came through clearly enough. He did not know immediately who was playing. He had not heard the elevator clearly enough to identify it as a return rather than an arrival, and his first thought was that one of the session musicians had forgotten something and come back. But the playing was not the playing of someone who had come back for a forgotten item. It had the quality of something that had been going on for a long time before it started, of someone settling into something rather than beginning something. He stood in the corridor and listened for perhaps 10 minutes before he moved closer. Not into the studio. The door was closed, and opening it felt like crossing a line that the closed door was clearly marking, but close enough to hear more clearly. Close enough to sit down on the floor with his back against the wall beside the studio door, which is what he did, because his legs had decided that standing was no longer required and that the floor was where this particular listening needed to happen. What Sam played that night was not any song Daniel recognized. It was not from any album. It was not structured the way songs are structured. It moved the way thoughts move, or the way certain kinds of feeling move, without a fixed destination, finding its shape as it went. There were moments that sounded like the beginning of something, a phrase that repeated, a pattern that seemed to be going somewhere, and then the something would become something else, would turn in a direction Daniel hadn't expected, and he would follow it into the new direction without quite knowing how he had gotten there. He sat on the floor outside the studio door and listened. He had his clipboard in his lap. He had stopped looking at it approximately 30 seconds after the piano started. The inventory was not finished. He had stopped caring about the inventory approximately 30 seconds after the piano started.
He had been planning to quit. Not that night specifically, he hadn't chosen the night yet, but the decision had been forming for weeks, in the way that decisions form when you have been doing something that isn't working for long enough that the not working starts to feel like an answer. He had come to New York to write music. He had been in New York for 8 months and had written almost nothing that he believed in. He had a job that was adjacent to music without being music. He had an apartment that was too expensive and a bank account that was shrinking, and a growing sense that what he had believed about himself at 18, that he had something, that the music inside him was real and particular and worth pursuing, had been the belief of someone who didn't know enough yet to know it wasn't true. He was going to go back home. That was the decision he had been forming. Go back, do something practical, stop waiting for something that wasn't coming. He had not told anyone yet. He had not even fully admitted it to himself yet, but it was there, sitting in the corner of every day, getting easier to look at and harder to argue with. He sat on the floor outside the studio door with his clipboard in his lap and listened to Sam Cooke play piano alone in the middle of the night. And he felt something shift, not as a thought, but as a change in the quality of the air around a decision that had seemed settled and was now, for reasons he could not have articulated, less settled than it had been. Just the music, just the thing itself, moving through the door and into the corridor, and into a young man who had been about to give up and was now, sitting on a cold floor with a clipboard in his lap, not so sure. The piano played, the corridor was quiet, the building around him was quiet, and Daniel sat with the clipboard in his lap and did not move, and did not think about going home, and did not think about quitting, and did not think about anything except the music coming through the door.
At some point, he did not know when he had stopped tracking time, the piano stopped. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the silence before the piano had started. It had been filled, and now it was empty in a specific way, the way a room is empty after something has been in it. Daniel heard the bench move. He heard Sam stand up. He heard footsteps moving toward the studio door. He should have moved. He had time, a few seconds, enough to stand and walk back toward the office and not be sitting on the floor directly outside the door when it opened. He did not move. Whether it was because his legs had been on the cold floor for 3 hours and had strong opinions about standing up, or because some part of him had decided that this was a moment that required being present for rather than escaping from, he did not move. He sat on the floor with his clipboard in his lap and waited. The door opened. Sam Cooke walked out into the corridor and found a 22-year-old studio assistant sitting against the wall, looking up at him. Sam looked at him. Daniel looked back. The corridor was very quiet. Neither of them said anything for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Sam said, "How long have you been there?" Daniel said, "A while." Sam looked at him for another moment, the specific look of someone taking in information and deciding what it means. Not angry, not embarrassed, something more like the look of a man who has been alone and has discovered he wasn't quite as alone as he thought, and who is deciding whether that changes anything. He said, "Good night." Daniel said, "Good night." Sam walked to the elevator. The doors opened. He got in. The doors closed. The floor indicator above the elevator showed the numbers descending. 3, 2, 1. Lobby. And then the building was quiet again, and Daniel was alone in the corridor, and the studio door was closed again, and the piano behind it was silent. He did not move for a while longer. He sat on the floor and let the silence settle, and let the 3 hours settle, and let whatever had shifted shift the rest of the way.
He did not quit. He went back to the office and finished the inventory. It took 20 minutes, the part that had been left undone, and he was surprised by how little time it had taken. And he went home when the sun was coming up, walking through the early morning streets of New York with his clipboard under his arm and the city just beginning to wake up around him. He wrote the first song he had believed in since he came to New York, 3 days later, in his apartment at 2 in the morning. He did not know why it came then and not before. He did not try to explain it. He sat down at the small upright piano he had bought second-hand and had been looking at for 2 months without playing it, and he played, and something came out that was not perfect and was not finished and was the truest thing he had written in years. He stayed up until 5 working on it. When he finally stopped, he sat on his piano bench in the gray early morning and felt something that he recognized distantly as the feeling he had been chasing since he was 12 years old. The feeling of having made something that was actually his. He became a musician. Not famous, not the kind of famous that gets written about in magazines or remembered in documentaries. The kind of real that comes from deciding, once and for the last time, that the thing you were going to give up is the thing you cannot give up. He played small venues. He made records that people who found them tended to keep. He taught music to younger people who were trying to figure out the same things he had been trying to figure out. He lived, in other words, the life that the decision on the corridor floor had made possible. Sam Cooke died in December 1964. Daniel heard the news on the radio and sat with it for a long time. He had spoken 2 sentences to Sam Cooke. He had never told Sam what that night had meant, had no way to tell him, had never had the occasion, and would not have known how to say it even if he had. He had sat on a floor and heard something through a closed door and gone home and written a song. That was all that had happened in any technical sense, but that was not all that had happened. What had happened was that a 22-year-old who had been about to make a permanent decision had heard something that changed the quality of that decision. Had heard what music sounded like when it had nothing to prove, when there was no audience and no career and no anything except the music itself, and had understood in that hearing that the thing he was about to give up was not the thing he had thought it was. He had thought it was a career he was giving up. What he had nearly given up was the music itself. And the music, heard through a closed door at 3 in the morning, had told him it was still there. He never told anyone about the floor outside the studio door. It felt like something that belonged to him and to the corridor and to the sound that had come through the door, and putting it into words felt like the wrong kind of handling for something that delicate. But the music he wrote for the rest of his life had something in it, a quality that people who knew him well could sometimes hear. Something about the way it moved, the way it found its shape as it went, without a fixed destination. Something that sounded, to anyone who knew what they were listening for, like someone who had once sat on a floor outside a closed door and heard what music sounds like when it has nowhere to be and nothing to prove and no one watching. Just itself, just the thing that was always there before everything else. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe
Every day we tell the stories behind the music, the moments that nobody planned and nobody announced. Hit the like button if you believe that the most important things happen when nobody is performing. And tell us in the comments, have you ever heard something that changed a decision you had already made? Because Daniel heard Sam Cooke play piano alone at 3 in the morning, and he never went home. We'll see you in the next one.